She died. Then her lookalike best friend took her place, as a mother to her only child and a wife to her husband. Hi, my beautiful and extraordinary family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Every time I speak to you, it's like talking to the heartbeat of my soul. You are not just followers, you are my light in the dark, the calm in my storm, and the reason I still believe in kindness, loyalty, and love that asks for nothing in return. To every new member who just joined this family, welcome home. Here we don't just tell stories, we live them together, cry together, and feel every emotion as one. I promise you, with all I have, you will be seen, loved, and never forgotten here. And to my loyal warriors who've stood with me through every twist and turn, I bow my heart to you. I don't need millions, I just need you. Please, my dear family, don't just watch in silence. Let me feel your heart in the comments. Write, I am with you. Let me know I still matter to you, because you always matter to me. And here is my prayer for you, whispered from the deepest part of my being. May love wrap around your soul like a warm embrace. May peace find your doorstep when worry knocks. May your days be gentle, your nights be kind, and may you never forget you are deeply, endlessly loved. Now take a deep breath, feel my love, and let's begin today's story with all the warmth, respect, and soul I can give. Rain drummed against the iron gates of the Vidal mansion like nature's own funeral march. Susie Lama stood motionless in the downpour, studying the imposing Gothic structure that had been her twin sister's home for the past 6 years. The black dress she wore, Sarah's favorite, borrowed from her closet, hung damply against her shivering frame as she gathered courage for what lay ahead. Sarah would have wanted me here, she told herself, gripping the bouquet of white lilies that had always been her sister's favorite. She would have wanted me to say goodbye properly. It had been 6 weeks since the accident. 6 weeks since a rain-slicked highway had claimed her sister's life, leaving behind a devastated husband and a traumatized little girl who hadn't spoken since the funeral. The massive oak doors opened before she could knock, revealing a stern-faced butler whose eyes widened in shock upon seeing her. For a moment, time seemed suspended as he stared at her face, Sarah's face, before quickly composing himself. Mrs. Vidal. We weren't expecting—" His confusion was palpable. "I'm Susie Lama," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah's twin sister. I've come for the memorial service." The butler's relief was visible. "Of course, Miss Lama. Please come in. The family is gathered in the main parlor." Susie stepped into the marble foyer, her breath catching at the overwhelming elegance that surrounded her. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across pristine white walls, adorned with priceless artwork. This had been Sarah's world, a world of luxury and privilege that seemed as foreign to Susie as a distant planet. Mama, you came back!" The small voice pierced the silence like a bell. Susie turned to see a little girl with flowing auburn hair racing down the grand staircase, her small feet sliding on the marble floor. Ruby, Sarah's 5-year-old daughter, her niece, launched herself into Susie's arms with such desperate force that she nearly knocked her over. "Mama, I knew you'd come back. I knew you wouldn't stay gone forever." Ruby sobbed into Susie's shoulder, her tiny hands clutching the black fabric. "Everyone said you went to heaven, but I prayed every night that you'd come home." Susie's chest constricted painfully as she held the grieving child, feeling Ruby's hot tears soaking through her dress. The little girl's anguish was so raw, so pure, that it took everything in Susie's power not to break down completely. "Ruby, sweetheart," Susie whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she gently stroked the child's hair. "I'm not— What is the meaning of this?" The voice was sharp, commanding, and filled with an authority that made everyone in the vicinity freeze. Susie looked up to see an elegantly dressed woman descending the staircase, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her blue eyes so similar to Stephen's, calculating and cold. This had to be Celeste Sinclair, Stephen's mother, the woman Sarah had described in their phone calls, with a mixture of fear and frustration. "Ruby, darling, come away from there immediately," Celeste commanded, but Ruby only clung tighter to Susie. "No, it's Mama. She came back just like I prayed." Ruby's voice was muffled against Susie's shoulder, but her defiance was clear. Celeste's eyes narrowed as they studied Susie's face with calculating intensity. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by Ruby's quiet sniffles and the distant sound of rain against the windows. Susie could almost see the wheels turning in the older woman's mind, formulating some plan that made her stomach uneasy. "You must be Susie," Celeste said finally, her voice suddenly warm, almost motherly. "Sarah spoke of you often. The resemblance is extraordinary, almost like a gift from Providence." "Mrs. Sinclair," Susie replied carefully, still holding Ruby close. "I'm sorry for your loss. Sarah was everything to me." "And to us," Celeste agreed, but there was something calculating in her expression that made Susie's skin crawl. "Ruby, my dear, why don't you go with Mrs. Henderson to the kitchen for some milk and cookies? I need to speak with your Aunt Susie, privately." "No!" Ruby's grip tightened. "I don't want to leave Mama. She just came back." Susie's heart ached as she gently pried Ruby's hands from her dress. "I'll be right here, sweetheart, I promise. I just need to talk to your grandmother for a few minutes, okay?" Ruby's lower lip trembled, but she nodded reluctantly. "You promise you won't leave like before?" "I promise," Susie whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to Ruby's forehead. Once the child was out of earshot, Celeste's demeanor shifted completely. The warm facade melted away, replaced by something sharp and predatory. "Walk with me," Celeste said, leading Susie toward a set of French doors that opened onto a covered terrace. "We have much to discuss." The terrace overlooked manicured gardens that Sarah had lovingly tended, now shrouded in mist and shadow. Celeste moved to the stone railing, her manicured fingers gripping the edge as she stared out at the rain-soaked landscape. "My son is destroying himself," she said without preamble, "not physically but emotionally. The guilt over Sarah's death is consuming him piece by piece." Susie's throat constricted. "What happened?" "Sarah never told me the details. She just said there was an accident. Stephen had a crucial business meeting that night, a merger that would secure his company's future. Sarah was bringing him forgotten documents, but the roads were treacherous. With rain." Celeste's voice was carefully modulated, each word chosen for maximum impact. "She died trying to help him succeed. He's convinced himself that his ambition killed her." The ache in Susie's chest intensified. She could picture it perfectly. Sarah, always eager to support the husband she adored, driving too fast on dangerous roads because Stephen needed her help. "Ruby hasn't been the same since the funeral," Celeste continued. "She barely eats, rarely speaks, just sits by her window waiting for her mother to return. The child psychologists say she's retreating into fantasy to cope with unbearable loss." "She spoke to me," Susie whispered. "Exactly." Celeste turned to face her, and Susie was struck by the intensity in her blue eyes. "You're identical to Sarah in every way. Ruby sees her mother when she looks at you. For the first time in weeks she smiled, she laughed, she spoke. What are you suggesting?" Celeste reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope sealed with red wax. "Before Sarah died, she wrote a letter, a final request that was to be opened only in the event of her death." With trembling fingers, Susie broke the seal and unfolded the expensive stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably Sarah's, the same flowing script they had both learned in childhood. "If something happens to me, Please ask Susie to care for Ruby and Stephen. They are my heart, and I cannot bear the thought of them suffering alone. Susie knows how to love completely without reservation. She can heal them both if given the chance. Please make sure they become a family. It's my dying wish. Sarah. Tears blurred Susie's vision as she read the words twice, 3 times, trying to process their meaning. Sarah wanted you to marry Stephen, Celeste said gently, to become Ruby's mother and Stephen's wife, to save them both. That's impossible, Susie breathed. Stephen doesn't even know me. We've never met, and I could never replace Sarah in his heart. You wouldn't be replacing her, Celeste said, moving closer. You'd be honoring her final wish. Stephen is so consumed with guilt that he can barely function. Ruby is withering away before our eyes, but you could save them both. This is insane. People don't just marry strangers because a dying woman asked them to save the people she loved most. Celeste's voice was soft but persuasive. Sarah trusted you with her most precious treasures, Susie. She believed in your capacity for love, for sacrifice. Will you honor her faith in you? Through the French doors, Susie could see Ruby sitting in the parlor, her small face pressed against the window as she watched for Susie's return. The child's expression was so hopeful, so desperate, that it made Susie's chest tight with emotion. Stephen would never agree to this, Susie said weakly. He will, Celeste replied with absolute certainty. He'll do anything to help Ruby heal, and once he sees how you care for her, how you bring light back into our home, he'll understand that Sarah's wisdom was perfect. But I don't know anything about being a mother or a wife to a man like him. Love isn't about knowledge, dear, Celeste said, placing a gentle hand on Susie's shoulder. It's about instinct, about sacrifice, about putting others before yourself. Sarah saw that quality in you. She trusted you with everything that mattered to her. Susie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her sister's final request settling over her like a mantle. Sarah had always been the strong one, the confident one, the one who knew exactly what she wanted from life. If she believed that Susie could save her family, then maybe, just maybe, she was right. When? Susie whispered. Tomorrow, Celeste said. Stephen returns from his business trip tonight. I'll show him Sarah's letter in the morning, and we'll arrange everything immediately. Ruby needs stability, not prolonged uncertainty. As if summoned by their conversation, Ruby appeared at the French doors, her small hands pressed against the glass as she mouthed the word "Mama" over and over again. Susie's decision crystallized. In that moment, whether it was love, duty, or simple compassion, she couldn't walk away from the child who so desperately needed her. "All right," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll do it. For Sarah, for Ruby." Celeste smiled, and for a moment it seemed genuinely warm. "Sarah was right about you, dear. You have the heart of a true mother." As they walked back inside, Susie allowed herself to hope that maybe, somehow, this impossible situation could work. Maybe she could help heal the broken little girl who clung to her like a lifeline. Maybe she could ease the guilt of a man she'd never met but already ached for. She had no idea that she was walking into a trap that would cost her everything she held dear. Chapter 2. The Wedding Trap and the Sacred Vow. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Vidal mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors as Susie stood in Sarah's former bedroom, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror. The wedding dress, a simple but elegant ivory silk gown that Celeste had somehow procured overnight, fit her perfectly, as if it had been tailored specifically for her body, which was impossible, of course, unless... It was Sarah's, Celeste said from the doorway, as if reading her thoughts. Her backup dress. She was always prepared for any eventuality. Susie's fingers trembled as she touched the delicate pearl buttons that ran down the front of the bodice. This feels wrong. I shouldn't be wearing her dress, marrying her husband. You're fulfilling her dying wish, Celeste reminded her gently, moving into the room to adjust the dress's train. Stephen read the letter this morning. He was emotional, but he understands the necessity of this arrangement. Arrangement. The word tasted bitter on Susie's tongue. Is that what we're calling it? What would you prefer? A marriage of convenience? A therapeutic intervention? Celeste's voice was pragmatic, businesslike. Call it whatever helps you sleep at night, dear. The important thing is that Ruby gets the mother she needs. Through the open window, Susie could hear the sound of workers setting up chairs in the garden below. A small ceremony, Celeste had explained, just family and a few close friends. Nothing elaborate or ostentatious that might seem disrespectful to Sarah's memory. Where is Stephen? Susie asked, realizing she still hadn't met the man she was about to marry. Preparing himself mentally, Celeste replied. This is difficult for him, as I'm sure you understand. He's doing this purely for Ruby's sake. Are they? Words stung more than Susie expected. Of course, he was only doing this for his daughter. What else could she have expected? That a billionaire businessman would suddenly fall madly in love with his dead wife's twin sister overnight. A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," Celeste called. Ruby peeked around the doorframe, her eyes widening, as she took in Susie's appearance. The little girl was dressed in a pale pink dress with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem, clearly her best outfit. "Mama, you look like a princess," Ruby whispered, her voice filled with awe. Susie's heart clenched. She knelt down, bringing herself to Ruby's eye level. "Ruby, sweetheart, I need you to understand something. I'm not your mama. I'm your Aunt Susie. I look like your mama because we were twins, but—" "No," Ruby said firmly, shaking her head. "You came back to me. You promised you wouldn't leave again." Celeste placed a warning hand on Susie's shoulder. "Don't confuse the child today," she murmured. "Let her have this happiness. You can work on the details later." Susie wanted to argue, but Ruby's small hand slipped into hers, warm and trusting, and she couldn't bring herself to shatter the little girl's fragile hope. 30 minutes later, Susie found herself walking down the garden path toward an arbor decorated with white roses and baby's breath. The few guests in attendance, mostly business associates and family friends, watched with solemn expressions, clearly understanding the unusual nature of this ceremony. And then she saw him. Stephen Vidal stood beneath the arbor with his back to her, his broad shoulders rigid beneath an impeccably tailored black suit. His dark hair caught the morning light, and when he turned to watch her approach, Susie nearly faltered. He was extraordinarily handsome in the way that only grief could sharpen a man. All defined edges and haunted depths. His blue eyes, so like his mother's, but infinitely sadder, met hers for the first time, and Susie felt something profound pass between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the simple human understanding of shared loss. But what struck her most was the careful emptiness in his gaze. He was looking at her without really seeing her, his expression professionally polite, as if he were conducting a business transaction rather than attending his own wedding. Ruby walked beside her, carrying a small bouquet of white daisies and, beaming with joy, "Daddy, look! Mama came back just like I said she would." Stephen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he managed a smile for his daughter. "Yes, sweetheart, she did." The ceremony itself was mercifully brief. The minister, clearly uncomfortable with the circumstances, kept his words simple and traditional. When it came time for vows, Stephen spoke first, his voice steady but emotionless. "I promise to provide for you, to protect you, and to honor the memory of the woman who brought us together," he said, sliding a simple gold band onto Susie's finger without meeting her eyes. Susie's throat was tight as she spoke her own vows, the words feeling surreal as they left her lips. I promise to care for your daughter as if she were my own, to honor Sarah's memory, and to do whatever is necessary to help this family heal. You may kiss the bride, the minister said quietly. Stephen hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Susie's cheek. It was over so quickly that she barely felt the touch of his lips, but her skin tingled where he'd kissed her. Ruby clapped her hands in delight. Now we're a real family again. The reception was equally subdued, a simple lunch served on the terrace with polite conversation about business and weather. Stephen spoke to the guests, but barely acknowledged Susie's presence, treating her like a necessary but unwelcome piece of furniture. As evening approached and the last guests departed, Susie found herself alone with her new husband and daughter in the mansion's vast living room. Ruby was curled up on the sofa between them, chattering happily about her day while they both maintained careful silence. Ruby needs a bath and bedtime story, Stephen said finally, his first direct words to Susie since the ceremony. I can do that, Susie offered quickly. We'll do it together, he replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Bath time revealed more about the family dynamics than any conversation could have. Ruby was clearly used to a routine with her father. He washed her hair while she played with rubber ducks, and she insisted on wearing specific pajamas decorated with cartoon unicorns. Mama always read me The Secret Garden before bed, Ruby announced as they tucked her into her princess-themed bedroom. Susie's breath caught. Sarah had read her the same book when they were children. I know that story, Susie said softly, settling into the chair beside Ruby's bed. Your mama read it to me too, when we were little girls. Really? Ruby's eyes widened with wonder. Really? We shared a bedroom just like the children in the story share their secret world. As Susie began to read, she became aware of Stephen standing in the doorway, listening. His expression had softened slightly, and for the first time all day, he seemed to really see her rather than looking through her. By the time she finished the chapter, Ruby was fast asleep, her small hand still clutching Susie's fingers. Susie carefully extracted herself and followed Stephen into the hallway. She hasn't slept that peacefully since... Stephen's voice trailed off. Since Sarah died, Susie finished gently. He nodded, his jaw working as he struggled with some internal battle. This arrangement, I want you to understand that it's purely for Ruby's benefit. I don't expect anything from you beyond caring for my daughter. I understand, Susie replied, though the words stung. Good. He turned to leave, then paused. Your bedroom is the blue room at the end of the hall. You'll find everything you need there. Where will you sleep? My study has a sofa. I often work late anyway. His voice was carefully neutral. Stephen, good night, Susie. He walked away before she could finish, his footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. Susie made her way to the blue room, which turned out to be a beautifully appointed guest suite with its own sitting area and bathroom. Someone, probably the efficient Mrs. Henderson, had already moved her few belongings from her tiny apartment into the walk-in closet. She changed into her simple cotton nightgown and sat on the edge of the king-size bed, trying to process the surreal events of the day. She was married to a man she'd spoken less than 50 words to, a man who clearly saw her as nothing more than a live-in nanny for his grieving daughter. But as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the mansion settling around her, Susie found herself thinking about the glimpse of vulnerability she'd seen in Stephen's eyes when Ruby fell asleep so peacefully. Beneath his cold exterior, she sensed a man drowning in guilt and grief, holding himself together through sheer force of will. In his study, 3 floors below, Stephen sat at his mahogany desk, staring at a photograph of Sarah and Ruby taken just weeks before the accident. Sarah's face smiled back at him, radiant with happiness and life, while Ruby giggled in her mother's arms. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the photograph. "I know this isn't what you wanted, but I won't dishonor your memory by pretending to love someone else." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small black velvet box. Inside was Sarah's engagement ring, a stunning princess-cut diamond that had belonged to his grandmother. He'd planned to bury it with Sarah, but something had stopped him at the last moment. Now he understood why. "I swear to you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I will never touch another woman. My body, my heart, my soul, they belong to you alone. This marriage is just paperwork, just a way to help Ruby heal. Susie will care for our daughter, and I'll make sure she's provided for. But that's all. I promise you, Sarah. I promise." He closed the box with a soft snap and locked it back in the drawer. Then he stretched out on the leather sofa, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion finally claimed him. Neither Stephen nor Susie slept well that first night, both struggling with the weight of promises made and boundaries established. But 3 floors above them, in her princess bedroom, Ruby slept deeply and peacefully for the first time in weeks, dreaming of her mama who had come back to her, just like she'd prayed for every night. In the morning, everything would change. But for this one night, the broken family had found a moment of peace. Chapter 3. The Cruel Revelation. The morning sun cast deceptively cheerful rays through the breakfast room windows as Susie helped Ruby with her cereal. The little girl chattering happily about the dream she'd had where her mama taught her to ride a unicorn. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Susie allowed herself to feel something approaching hope. Ruby's laughter was like music after weeks of silence. And even though Stephen had already left for an early morning meeting without so much as a goodbye, there was a tentative peace settling over the household. "Mama Susie, can we go to the garden? And today, I want to show you the roses that smell like candy," Ruby said, her spoon creating milk ripples as she gestured excitedly. "Of course, sweetheart," Susie replied, gently guiding the spoon back to the bowl. "But remember what we talked about. I'm your Aunt Susie, who looks like Mama, not good morning, family." Celeste's voice sliced through their quiet moment with surgical precision. She stood in the doorway of the breakfast room, impeccably dressed, in a navy blue suit, despite the early hour, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the domestic scene before her. There was something different about her today, a cold satisfaction that made Susie's skin prickle with unease. "Grandmama." Ruby jumped up from her chair and ran to embrace Celeste, who returned the hug with surprising warmth. "Hello, my darling. Did you sleep well?" Celeste asked, smoothing Ruby's hair. "The best sleep ever. Mama read me about the secret garden, and I dreamed about magical places." Something flickered in Celeste's eyes, satisfaction perhaps, or calculation. "How wonderful. Ruby, why don't you go play in your room for a while? I need to speak with Susie about some important matters." Ruby's face fell. "But we were going to see the roses." "Later, sweetheart," Susie said quickly, sensing an undercurrent of tension in the older woman's demeanor. "Go choose which book you'd like me to read to you tonight." Once Ruby had skipped away, Celeste's warm facade melted like ice in summer. She moved to the sideboard and poured herself a cup of coffee with movements so precise they seemed almost mechanical. "Well," she said without turning around, "that was easier than I expected." "What was easier?" Susie asked, confusion creeping into her voice. Celeste turned, her blue eyes cold as winter frost. "Getting Stephen married before his 32nd birthday. Do you have any idea how close we came to losing everything?" The coffee cup in Susie's hands began to tremble. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, my dear naive girl," Celeste laughed. But there was no warmth in the sound. "Did you really think this was purely about Ruby's emotional well-being? About honoring Sarah's touching final wishes?" The letter, Sarah's letter said nothing of the sort. Celeste reached into her purse and withdrew a familiar piece of stationery, but this time it was blank. I've become quite accomplished with handwriting replication over the years, useful skill in certain business dealings. The world seemed to tilt beneath Susie's feet. You forged Sarah's handwriting? Every single word. Celeste's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. Sarah's actual last words were asking for pain medication and mumbling about her garden, nothing nearly so convenient or poetic as what I created for your consumption. Susie's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor and sending dark liquid spreading across the pristine white stone. But why? Why would you? Because my father-in-law was a paranoid old patriarch who inserted ridiculous stipulations into his will, Celeste snapped, her composure finally showing cracks. Stephen had to be married by his 32nd birthday, which was 2 days ago, or forfeit his entire inheritance. The company, the properties, the trust funds, everything would have gone to charity instead of staying in family hands where it belongs. His birthday. Susie's voice was barely a whisper. Yesterday, Celeste confirmed with satisfaction. He turned 32 yesterday, and thanks to your touching willingness to play the grieving saint, he's now legally married, and his inheritance is secure. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. You used me. I used you brilliantly, Celeste corrected. Stephen would never have agreed to marry some random woman for money, but he couldn't resist the chance to help his precious daughter. And you were perfect, identical to Sarah, desperate to honor her memory, naive enough to believe in deathbed wishes and tragic romance. Susie felt sick, bile rising in her throat as she realized the full scope of her manipulation. Stephen doesn't know. Of course he doesn't know. He thinks he married you out of love for his daughter and respect for his dead wife's wishes. He has no idea that his inheritance depended on it, or that the letter was a forgery. You have to tell him the truth. Celeste's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Why would I do that? The marriage served its purpose. Stephen's inheritance is secure, and now we can move on to the next phase of the plan. Next phase? The divorce, of course. Celeste moved closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You've played your part beautifully, dear, but the performance is over. I need you gone before Stephen starts developing any inconvenient feelings for his dead wife's replacement. I won't do it, Susie said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Ruby needs stability, not another abandonment. Ruby will adjust. Children are remarkably resilient. Celeste's tone was dismissive. Besides, you're not her mother. You're just a stranger who happens to share Sarah's face. I may not be her mother, but I love her. Love? Celeste's eyebrows rose mockingly. You've known the child for exactly 24 hours. What you're feeling is sympathy, guilt, and misplaced maternal instinct. It will pass. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both turn. Stephen appeared in the doorway, still wearing his coat from his morning meeting, his expression shifting from neutral to concerned as he took in the tense atmosphere. Is everything all right? He asked, his gaze moving between Susie's pale face and his mother's rigid posture. Actually, darling, I'm glad you're here, Celeste said, her voice suddenly bright and artificial. I was just explaining to Susie that yesterday's ceremony has served its purpose, and it's time for her to return to her own life. Stephen went very still. What do you mean, served its purpose? The therapeutic value for Ruby, Celeste said smoothly. Susie helped Ruby through her initial grief, but prolonging this charade will only confuse the child further. It's better to end things cleanly now, before any permanent damage is done. No. The word came out flat and hard. Ruby is finally sleeping, finally eating. She's smiling again. I won't disrupt that. Stephen, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. He cut his mother off, his voice gaining volume. Ruby lost her mother. She's barely begun to heal. Taking Susie away now would be cruel. Celeste's mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of frustration. You're thinking with your emotions instead of your head. This woman is not Sarah, no. Matter how much she looks like her, Ruby needs to learn to live without clinging to illusions. The only illusion here, Stephen said quietly, his eyes fixed on his mother's face, is that you ever cared about Ruby's well-being over your own agenda, Susie. Watch the exchange with growing dread, sensing currents of old anger and resentment flowing between mother and son. But before she could say anything, the sound of small feet running down the hallway interrupted them. "Mama! Daddy!" Ruby burst into the room, her face glowing with excitement. "I picked 3 books for tonight, and I drew you a picture of our garden and—" She stopped abruptly, her smile fading as she sensed the tension in the room. Why does everyone look sad? The silence stretched taut as a wire. Susie could see Stephen's internal struggle, the war between his protective instincts and his respect for his mother's wishes. She could see Celeste calculating her next move, preparing to deliver whatever blow would secure her victory. "Ruby, darling," Celeste said gently, kneeling to the child's level, "I'm afraid Aunt Susie has to go back to her own home now. She only came to visit for a little while." "No!" Ruby's scream was sharp and desperate. "No, she can't leave! She promised she wouldn't leave like Mama did!" "Ruby, sweetheart!" Susie started forward, but Celeste's hand on her arm stopped her. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Celeste hissed under her breath. But Ruby had already launched herself at Susie, wrapping her small arms around Susie's waist and holding on with desperate strength. "Please don't go, Mama, please. I'll be good, I promise. I won't ask for anything else, just please don't leave me." Susie's heart shattered as she knelt and gathered the sobbing child in her arms. "Oh, sweetheart, this isn't about you being good. You're perfect, you're wonderful. Then why are you leaving?" Ruby's voice was muffled against Susie's shoulder, but her pain was crystal clear. Stephen was watching the scene with an expression of agony, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Mother, enough. I won't put Ruby through this." "You don't have a choice," Celeste said coldly. "The arrangement was temporary, and it's over. Mrs. Henderson has already called a car for Miss Lama." As if summoned by her words, the housekeeper appeared in the doorway, looking deeply uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, sir, but the car is here." "Send it away," Stephen ordered. "You will do no such thing," Celeste countermanded. "Miss Lama is leaving, now." Ruby's sobs grew louder, her grip on Susie tightening until it was almost painful. "Don't let them take me away from you. Please, Mama." Susie looked up at Stephen, her eyes pleading for help, for understanding, for anything that might prevent this cruelty. But his expression had shuttered, the brief warmth she'd glimpsed the night before replaced by cold resignation. "Perhaps," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him something, "it would be better to make a clean break before Ruby gets more attached." The betrayal hit Susie like a physical blow. "Stephen, no. You saw how she slept last night, how happy she was this morning. Children are resilient," he repeated his mother's words mechanically. "She'll adjust." "But I won't," Susie whispered, the truth torn from her before she could stop it. "I won't adjust to losing her." For a moment something flickered in Stephen's eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition of genuine pain. But it was gone before Susie could be sure. "Take her to the car," Celeste instructed Mrs. Henderson. Gently but firmly. "No! No!" Ruby's screams echoed through the mansion as 2 staff members gently but inexorably pried her away from Susie. "Mama, don't leave me, please!" Susie's own tears were falling freely now as she was escorted toward the front door, Ruby's desperate cries following her down the hallway. At the threshold, she turned back to see Stephen standing frozen in the breakfast room doorway, his face a mask of controlled agony as his daughter's heart broke all over again. "She'll never forgive you for this," Susie said, her voice carrying clearly through the marble foyer. "And neither will I." The massive oak doors closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid falling shut, cutting off Ruby's sobs and sealing Susie's fate. As the car pulled away from the mansion, she could see Ruby's small face pressed against an upstairs window, her mouth open in a silent scream. Inside the mansion, Stephen sank into a chair as Ruby's cries gradually faded to exhausted whimpers. His mother stood beside him, victorious but oddly hollow. "You did the right thing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Stephen didn't answer. He was staring at the coffee stain on the marble floor where Susie's cup had shattered, and wondering why doing the right thing felt exactly like destroying everything he'd sworn to protect. Above them, Ruby's heartbroken sobs echoed through the halls like an accusation, a reminder of the price of their choices. The deception was complete. The trap had been sprung, and everyone had lost. Chapter 4. The Transformation and Discovery. 6 months had transformed Susie Lama from a struggling artist working 3 jobs to pay rent on a cramped studio apartment into the owner of a promising gallery in the city's arts district. The Lama Gallery occupied the ground floor of a beautifully restored Victorian building, its floor-to-ceiling windows displaying rotating collections that were beginning to attract critical attention and serious collectors. But the success hadn't come easily or without sacrifice. Standing in her gallery's main exhibition space, surrounded by paintings and sculptures that represented months of careful cultivation and strategic networking, Susie barely recognized the woman she'd become. Her long dark hair was now cut in a sophisticated bob that framed her face elegantly. Her wardrobe consisted of carefully chosen pieces that complemented her natural beauty without overwhelming it. And her eyes, once soft with trusting hope, now held a sharpness honed by hard-won experience. The transformation had begun the day she'd walked out of the Vidal mansion with Ruby's screams echoing in her ears. That night, alone in her tiny apartment, she'd made a decision that would reshape everything. She would never again allow herself to be used, manipulated, or discarded. If the world insisted on playing games, she would learn to play them better than anyone. Miss Lama? Her assistant, a sharp-eyed young man named Marcus, appeared at her elbow with a tablet in hand. "The Richardson piece sold this morning, and we have 3 inquiries about the Valdez sculpture." "Excellent," Susie replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd discovered she had a natural talent for business. "What about the charity auction preview tonight? Your dress is ready upstairs and the car will be here at 7, Marcus confirmed. "Are you sure you want to attend? It's bound to be complicated." Susie's smile was sharp as a blade. "I'm counting on it." The Sarah Vidal Memorial Foundation charity auction was the social event of the season, bringing together the city's elite to raise money for programs supporting orphaned children. It was also, Susie had discovered through careful research, a carefully constructed fraud. The discovery had been accidental. 3 weeks ago, while researching potential donors for her gallery, she'd noticed discrepancies in the foundation's public filings. The Sarah Vidal Memorial Foundation had been established immediately after the funeral, but within just weeks, someone had been systematically skimming money meant for grief counseling programs and support services. Curious, she dug deeper, using skills she'd developed during her years working as a bookkeeper for several art galleries before pursuing her own dreams. What she'd found made her stomach churn with disgust. The stolen funds already totaled nearly $500,000, all funneled through shell companies that eventually led back to one name, Celeste Sinclair. Stephen's mother had been stealing from his dead wife's memorial foundation, robbing money meant to help children exactly like Ruby. The betrayal was so profound, so utterly vile, that it had taken Susie hours to process the full scope of it. But once the shock had worn off, determination had taken its place. Celeste Sinclair had destroyed her chance at happiness, torn her away from a child she'd grown to love in just 24 hours, and manipulated them all for her own financial gain. It was time for some long-overdue justice. "Miss Lama?" Marcus's voice brought her back to the present. "There's something else," the art critic from Metropolitan Style magazine called. "She wants to do a feature story about your meteoric rise in the art world." "Schedule it for next week," Susie replied absently, her mind already focused on the evening ahead. "And Marcus, make sure my jewelry selection includes the sapphire necklace." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The one that matches your eyes?" "The one that belonged to Sarah Vidal," Susie corrected quietly. "She left it to me in her actual will. I think it's time I wore it." That evening, as Susie stepped out of her sleek black car in front of the Grand Regency Hotel, she knew she looked magnificent. The midnight blue gown hugged her curves before flowing into an elegant train, and Sarah's sapphire necklace sparkled at her throat like captured starlight. But more than her appearance, it was her presence that commanded attention, the confidence of a woman who'd learned to wield her beauty and intelligence as weapons. The hotel's ballroom was a glittering spectacle of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble floors, while the city's elite mingled beneath oil paintings worth more than most people's houses. Susie moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting compliments on her gallery and deflecting personal questions with charming evasion. She was studying the auction catalogue when she felt him before she saw him, a shift in the air, a sudden electrical awareness that made her skin tingle. Slowly, she turned. Stephen Vidal stood near the bar, devastating in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean frame. But it was his face that caught her breath. The sharp cheekbones and strong jaw were unchanged, but there were new lines around his eyes, a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible burdens. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and the impact was immediate and devastating. 6 months of separation, of anger and heartbreak and carefully constructed walls, crumbled in an instant. The chemistry between them was a living thing, crackling through the air with an intensity that made several nearby conversations pause. Stephen's whiskey glass froze halfway to his lips as he stared at her. Gone was the grieving, uncertain woman he'd dismissed from his home. In her place stood a goddess, confident, successful, utterly breathtaking. The midnight blue gown showcased every curve of her body, and the sapphire necklace. God, the sapphire necklace he'd given Sarah for their first anniversary. Susie. Her name left his lips like a prayer or a curse. He wasn't sure which. She approached him with the fluid grace of a predator, her smile cool and mysterious. "Stephen, how lovely to see you again." "You look." He struggled for words, his usual composure deserting him. "Different." "Success will do that," she replied smoothly. "I assume you've heard about my gallery?" "I've heard." His voice was rough. "Congratulations." "Thank you. I understand this auction is for Sarah's foundation." Her tone was perfectly pleasant, but something flickered in her eyes that made Stephen uneasy. "Yes, the programs she cared about." He took a sip of whiskey, needing the burn to ground him. How have you been?" "Wonderful," Susie replied, but there was steel beneath the silk. "I've learned so much these past months, about business, about people, about the way the world really works." Before Stephen could respond, a familiar voice cut through their conversation like a knife. Well, if it isn't our little gold digger, all dressed up and playing with the grown-ups. Celeste Sinclair glided toward them, resplendent in emerald green, her smile sharp enough to cut diamonds. But Susie noticed the slight widening of the older woman's eyes when she spotted the sapphire necklace, a flicker of calculation and concern. "Mrs. Sinclair," Susie said, her voice honey-sweet, "how generous of you to organize such a beautiful event for charity. I'm sure Sarah would be touched by your dedication to her memory." The emphasis on the word touched was subtle but unmistakable. Celeste's smile tightened. "I do what I can," Celeste replied carefully, "though I'm surprised to see you here. Charity galas are usually by invitation only." "Oh, but I was invited," Susie said, producing an elegant cream envelope from her small clutch. "As one of the city's emerging art dealers, I was specifically requested to attend. The organizers thought I might be interested in donating a piece for next year's auction." Stephen watched the exchange with growing confusion. There was an undercurrent here he didn't understand, layers of meaning in what seemed like polite conversation. "How wonderful," Celeste said through gritted teeth. "I'm sure we'd welcome your contribution." "I'm sure you would," Susie agreed, "especially given how much the foundation seems to need additional funding." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Celeste's face went pale, then flushed red. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Celeste asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, nothing specific," Susie replied innocently. "It's just that I've been researching various charities for potential partnerships with my gallery. Amazing what public records can reveal about an organization's efficiency in fund distribution." Stephen looked between the two women, sensing a battle being fought in a language he didn't speak. "Is there something I should know about?" "Nothing at all, darling," Celeste said quickly, but her composure was cracking. "Miss Lama is simply making conversation." "Actually," Susie said, her smile never wavering, "I was about to suggest that Stephen might want to review the Foundation's financial statements personally. As Sarah's widower and the primary donor, he has every right to ensure the money is being used exactly as intended." The suggestion hit Celeste like a physical blow. Her face went ashen, and Stephen noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her champagne glass. "The financial statements are handled by our accounting firm," Celeste said weakly. "Everything is properly managed." "I'm sure it is," Susie agreed. "But wouldn't it be wonderful if Stephen could see exactly how much good his donations are doing? I'd be happy to recommend an independent auditor if you'd like. I've become quite knowledgeable about financial oversight." The threat was delivered, with such elegant politeness that it took Stephen a moment to recognize it as such. But when he did, when he saw the fear in his mother's eyes and the predatory satisfaction in Susie's, he began to understand that something much larger was happening. "Not here, Mother," he said slowly. "Perhaps Susie has a point. It has been a while since I've personally reviewed the Foundation's operations." "That's completely unnecessary," Celeste began. "But responsible," Stephen cut her off, his eyes fixed on Susie's face. "Thank you for the suggestion, Susie. I'll arrange for a comprehensive audit first thing Monday morning." The triumph in Susie's eyes was brief but unmistakable. "You're welcome. Sarah would want to know her memory is being honored properly." As if sensing the conversation had reached a dangerous conclusion, several other guests approached their group, and the moment of intense confrontation was broken. But as the evening progressed, Stephen found himself watching Susie with a mixture of admiration and wariness. This was not the naive woman who'd agreed to marry him 6 months ago. This was someone who'd learned to play the game at the highest levels, and she was playing it against his family. The question was why, and what else she might know that could destroy them all. When the auction began, Susie bid aggressively on several pieces, her paddle rising with confident authority that spoke of serious money behind her success. She won a bronze sculpture for $50,000 and donated it immediately back to the foundation for future fundraising efforts, a gesture that earned her applause and further established her as a force to be reckoned with. But it was at the evening's end, as guests began to filter out into the night, that she delivered her final blow. "Stephen," she said, appearing at his elbow as he waited for his car, "I wanted you to know that I've thought about Ruby every day since I left." The mention of his daughter's name hit him like a physical blow. She's fine, adjusting well." Susie's smile was sad and knowing. "No, she's not, but she will be, once she understands that some people fight for the ones they love and others just let them go." Before he could respond, her car arrived and she was gone, leaving only the scent of jasmine and the echo of words that cut deeper than any blade. Standing on the hotel steps, watching her taillights disappear into the night, Stephen felt the first stirrings of something he'd buried 6 months ago. The terrible suspicion that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Inside the hotel, Celeste Sinclair stood at the ballroom windows, her reflection ghostly against the night sky, and knew that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The game had begun in earnest. Chapter 5. The Seduction of Revenge. 3 weeks after the Sarah Vidal Memorial Foundation auction, Stephen couldn't escape thoughts of Susie Lama. Not physically, though she seemed to appear at every important business function, charity event, and social gathering he attended. No, the inescapable presence was in his mind, where her midnight blue gown and knowing smile had taken up permanent residence, haunting his thoughts at the most inconvenient moments. Like now, as he sat in the boardroom of Meridian Technologies, trying to focus on acquisition projections while his business partner droned on about market analysis. The numbers on the screen blurred as he remembered the way Susie's eyes had sparkled with dangerous intelligence, the way she delivered her subtle threats with the precision of a master strategist. "Stephen, your thoughts on the third quarter and projections?" He blinked, realizing that 6 pairs of eyes were staring at him expectantly. "Solid," he said, hoping it was an appropriate response. "Very solid." His assistant, Jennifer, shot him a concerned look from her seat by the door. She'd been working for him long enough to recognize when his mind was elsewhere, and lately that had been happening with alarming frequency. After the meeting, Jennifer followed him into his office, closing the door behind her with purposeful authority. "Okay, what's going on?" she demanded, dropping into the chair across from his desk with the familiarity of someone who'd been managing his schedule for 5 years. "You've been distracted for weeks. You're getting invitations to events you normally wouldn't be caught dead at, and yesterday I found you staring out the window for 20 minutes straight." Stephen loosened his tie, suddenly feeling suffocated by the perfectly climate-controlled office. "It's nothing. Just some personal matters I need to resolve." "Does this have anything to do with Susie Lama?" The name hit him like an electric shock. "Why would you ask that?" Jennifer raised an eyebrow. "Because her name has been mentioned in every society column for the past month. She's been photographed at 3 events you attended. And every time I try to brief you on your schedule, you zone out completely." Before Stephen could deny the connection, his phone buzzed with a text message. Jennifer glanced at the screen and smirked. "Speaking of which, there's been a last-minute addition to tonight's Children's Hospital Gala. Apparently, Susie Lama has donated a piece from her gallery for the live auction, a painting that's expected to fetch quite a high price." Stephen's jaw tightened. Of course she had. The woman seemed to have an uncanny ability to position herself exactly where she'd have maximum impact. "Which painting?" Jennifer consulted her tablet. "Something called Morning Glory. It's described as a landscape piece with deep emotional resonance and historical significance." The blood drained from Stephen's face. Morning Glory was Sarah's favorite painting, a beautiful landscape of a garden in dawn light that had hung in their bedroom for 3 years. Sarah had discovered it at a small gallery in Provence during their honeymoon, and she'd stood in front of it for nearly an hour, tears streaming down her face as she described how it reminded her of the garden behind her childhood home. He'd sold the painting 6 months ago, along with most of Sarah's personal belongings, unable to bear the constant reminders of what he'd lost. But apparently it had found its way to Susie's gallery. "Clear my calendar for the rest of the day," he said abruptly, "and make sure my tuxedo is ready for tonight." "Stephen, are you sure?" "Just do it, Jennifer." That evening, Stephen arrived at the Children's Hospital Gala with one purpose: to buy back Sarah's painting, no matter the cost. The hospital's grand ballroom had been transformed into an elegant wonderland with soft lighting and floral arrangements that created an atmosphere of warmth and hope. But Stephen barely noticed the decorations. His attention was focused entirely on finding one particular woman. He spotted her near the registration table, and the sight of her hit him like a physical blow. Tonight, she wore emerald green silk that hugged her curves like liquid fire, and her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon that exposed the graceful line of her neck. She was surrounded by admirers, art collectors, business leaders, and society matrons, all vying for her attention. But she held court with the poise of a queen receiving tribute from her subjects. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and, once again, Stephen felt that jolt of electric awareness that seemed to accompany every encounter with Susie Lama. But this time, instead of looking away, she smiled, a slow, predatory curve of her lips that sent heat shooting straight to his groin. She excused herself from her admirers and moved toward him with the fluid grace of a dancer, her hips swaying hypnotically with each step. Other men turned to watch her pass, but her attention was focused entirely on Stephen, making him feel like the only man in the room. "Stephen," she said, her voice like warm honey. "What a pleasant surprise." "Susie." He managed to keep his voice steady despite the way her proximity was affecting him. "I understand you've donated a piece for tonight's auction." "I have. I hope you approve of my choice." Her smile widened, and he knew she was perfectly aware of which painting she'd contributed. "Art should be shared, don't you think? Kept locked away in private collections, it serves no one." The barb hit its mark. "That painting belonged to my wife." "Past tense," Susie noted gently. "It belongs to the children now, or rather, it will belong to whoever values it enough to pay for it." Before Stephen could respond, the evening's host, Dr. Margaret Chen, the hospital's chief administrator, approached with a warm smile. "Mr. Vidal, Ms. Lama, how wonderful to see you both here tonight. I was just telling the auction coordinator that we expect your painting to be one of our highest earners, Ms. Lama. The preview viewing has been quite popular." "I'm so pleased," Susie replied graciously. "Sarah always believed that art should bring joy to others. I can't think of a better way to honor her memory than by helping the children she cared so much about." The casual mention of his dead wife's name, spoken with such genuine warmth, caught Stephen off guard. For a moment, the polished, dangerous woman in front of him seemed to fade, replaced by a glimpse of the compassionate person who'd held his sobbing daughter with such tenderness. "You knew what that painting meant to her," he said quietly once Dr. Chen had moved on. "I know what all of her belongings meant to her," Susie replied, her voice softening. "She told me about every piece, the stories behind them, the memories they held. That painting reminded her of her mother's garden, where she used to pick morning glories for breakfast bouquets." Stephen stared at her, stunned. Sarah had never told him about the morning glories, about the connection to her mother's garden. But somehow Susie knew. "She talked about you, you know," Susie continued, her green eyes holding his captive. "During our phone calls before the accident, you were her everything, Stephen. her sun, her moon, her entire universe. Don't. The word came out harsher than he'd intended. Don't talk about her like you knew her. But I did know her, Susie said simply. She was my twin, my other half, my best friend. I knew her dreams, her fears, her deepest secrets, including how much she worried about you, worried about me. She was afraid you worked too hard, loved too fiercely, blamed yourself too harshly for things beyond your control. She used to say you carried the weight of the world on your shoulders, and she wished she could teach you to let some of it go. The words hit Stephen like arrows, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. This was information only Sarah could have shared, intimate knowledge that spoke to a relationship deeper than he'd ever imagined. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because Sarah loved you enough to want you to be happy," Susie replied. "And because I think you've forgotten what that looks like." Before he could respond, the lights dimmed and the auction began. They found seats at separate tables, but Stephen was acutely aware of Susie's presence throughout the evening. She bid on several items with casual authority, donating thousands of dollars to the hospital's programs with the grace of someone for whom money was no object. When Morning Glory appeared on the auction block, Stephen's breath caught. The painting was even more beautiful than he remembered, a masterpiece of light and color that seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. The bidding started at $10,000 and quickly escalated. Stephen raised his paddle, determined to reclaim this piece of Sarah's memory. But every time he bid, Susie countered, her paddle rising with cool confidence. 20,000, 30, 40. The other bidders dropped out one by one, leaving only Stephen and Susie locked in a battle of wills that had nothing to do with art and everything to do with the complex web of emotions binding them together. At $75,000, Stephen hesitated. The painting was worth perhaps $30,000 at most, and his rational mind rebelled against paying such an inflated price. In that moment of hesitation, Susie struck. 80,000, she called out clearly. Going once, going twice, sold. To bidder number 47. Stephen's heart sank as the gavel fell, but then something extraordinary happened. Susie stood, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom. "I would like to donate this painting to the Children's Hospital, to be displayed permanently in the pediatric wing, where young patients can find hope and beauty during their darkest hours." The applause was thunderous, but Stephen barely heard it. He stared at Susie in amazement, understanding finally dawning. She hadn't bought the painting to keep it from him. She'd bought it to give it the home Sarah would have wanted it to have. When the formal portion of the evening ended and dancing began, Stephen found himself walking towards Susie with a sense of inevitability. She stood alone on the terrace, the city lights creating a glittering backdrop behind her as she gazed out at the night sky. "Dance with me," he said without preamble. She turned, studying his face in the soft light. "I don't think that's wise." "I don't care." Without waiting for her answer, he took her hand and led her back into the ballroom, where couples were swaying to a slow, romantic melody. The moment his arms encircled her waist, the moment she placed her hands on his shoulders, the world disappeared. They moved together as if they'd danced 1,000 times before, their bodies finding a perfect rhythm that spoke to something deeper than physical attraction. Stephen could feel the heat of her skin through the silk of her dress, could smell the intoxicating scent of jasmine that seemed to emanate from her very pores. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the music. "Why? What?" she whispered back, her breath warm against his ear. "Why protect Ruby and me when we hurt you so badly?" Susie leaned back to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the ballroom's soft lights. "Because despite what your mother told you, despite what you chose to believe, I loved that little girl from the moment I met her, and I could never do anything to hurt her." even if it meant destroying me. Her smile was sad and knowing. Stephen, I could destroy you and your entire family with a phone call. Your mother has been embezzling from Sarah's foundation for 2 years. Nearly $2 million stolen from programs meant to help orphaned children. I have documentation, bank records, everything needed to send her to prison and ruin your family's reputation forever. Stephen went rigid, his feet stopping mid-step. What? But I won't, Susie continued, her voice gentle despite the devastating nature of her words. Because Ruby needs her father, and she doesn't deserve to pay for her grandmother's crimes. So I'll handle Celeste quietly, make sure the money is returned, and keep your family's secrets safe. Why would you protect us after what we did to you? Susie's hand moved to cup his cheek, her touch burning through him like fire. Because Ruby deserves better than to grow up believing that love is conditional, that people can be discarded when they become inconvenient, and because Sarah trusted me to take care of her family. The music swelled around them, but Stephen was lost in Susie's eyes, drowning in the implications of everything she'd revealed. She had the power to destroy him, but instead, she was protecting him. She'd been cast out of his home, rejected and humiliated, but still, she put Ruby's well-being above her own desire for revenge. Susie, he began, but she pressed a finger to his lips. Don't say anything you might regret, she warned softly. Don't make promises you can't keep or offer explanations that won't change anything. Just dance with me, Stephen. Let me have this one moment where I can pretend that things might have been different. So he danced with her, holding her close. As the music washed over them, feeling the warmth of her body against his and the rapid beating of her heart where her chest pressed against his. And for those few precious minutes, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to love this extraordinary woman the way she deserved to be loved. When the song ended, Susie stepped back, her professional mask sliding back into place. Thank you for the dance, she said formally. Enjoy the rest of your evening. She turned to leave, but Stephen caught her wrist, his fingers encircling the delicate bones with gentle insistence. This isn't over, he said, his voice rough with need and confusion and a dozen other emotions he couldn't name. Susie looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up to his face. Yes, it is, she replied quietly. It was over the day you chose your mother's agenda over your daughter's happiness, the day you decided I wasn't worth fighting for. She pulled free of his grasp and walked away, leaving Stephen standing alone on the dance floor with the taste of regret bitter in his mouth and the scent of jasmine lingering in the air like a promise of everything he'd lost. But as he watched her go, Stephen realized that for the first time in 6 months, he felt truly alive. The ice around his heart was beginning to crack, and beneath it, something dangerous was stirring to life. Desire, need, and maybe, just maybe, love. Chapter 6. The Investigation and Growing Desire. The private investigator's report lay open on Stephen's desk like an accusation, the neat columns of numbers and dates telling a story that made his stomach churn with equal parts rage and shame. 3 days had passed since his dance with Susie, 3 days of sleepless nights and obsessive research that had finally yielded the truth he'd been dreading to confirm. Susie had been right about everything. The embezzlement scheme was sophisticated, carefully hidden behind layers of legitimate expenses and administrative fees, but once Stephen knew what to look for, the pattern became clear. His mother had been systematically draining the Sarah Vidal Memorial Foundation since its inception, using her position as financial overseer to redirect funds meant for grief counseling programs and family support services. Nearly $500,000 stolen from children who'd lost their parents, from families struggling to rebuild their lives after devastating loss. Stephen's hands shook as he closed the file. His mother, the woman who'd raised him, who'd taught him about honor and responsibility, had been stealing from orphaned children while lecturing him about family loyalty. "Mr. Vidal," Jennifer's voice came through the intercom, hesitant and concerned. "Ruby's school called. She's in the nurse's office with a fever, but she's asking for someone called Mama Susie and won't let anyone else comfort her." Stephen's chest tightened. Ruby had been struggling since Susie's departure, nightmares, refusing to eat properly. The school counselor had expressed concern about Ruby's inability to process the loss. "I'll pick her up immediately," Stephen said, already reaching for his coat. 20 minutes later, he was kneeling beside a small bed in the school nurse's office, watching his daughter's flushed face and glassy eyes. Ruby looked so small, so fragile, curled up under a thin blanket with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy," she whispered when she saw him, "I don't feel good. I want Mama Susie." "I know, sweetheart," Stephen murmured, gathering her into his arms. "Let's get you home." But home provided no comfort. Ruby's fever spiked throughout the evening, and she was restless, crying out in her sleep, calling for people who weren't there. "Mama Susie," she whimpered as Stephen sat beside her bed at midnight, her small hand clutching his with surprising strength. "Please, Daddy. She makes the nightmares go away." At 2 in the morning, with Ruby's fever still climbing and her distress increasing, Stephen made a decision that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable. He called Susie. The phone rang 4 times before her sleep-roughened voice answered. "Hello? Susie, it's Stephen." He paused, swallowing his pride. "I need your help. Ruby's sick and asking for you." "I'll be right there." 20 minutes later, Susie stood in the foyer wearing simple jeans and a soft sweater, her hair pulled back, in a messy bun, no makeup to hide the concern etched across her features. She was more beautiful than any of the polished women who'd tried to catch his attention over the past months. "Where is she?" Susie asked. "Upstairs, 3rd door on the right." When Susie entered Ruby's bedroom, the little girl's eyes flew open, as if she'd sensed her presence. "Mama Susie," Ruby's voice was weak but filled with desperate relief. "You came back!" "Of course I came back, sweetheart," Susie said, settling into the chair beside Ruby's bed. "I promised I'd always be here when you needed me." As Susie began reading The Secret Garden, Stephen found himself drawn into the room, settling into the chair on the other side of Ruby's bed. In the soft lamplight, watching Susie comfort his daughter with such tenderness, he felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the iron bands he'd wrapped around his heart. Within an hour, Ruby was sleeping peacefully, her fever breaking as she found the peace that had eluded her all evening. Stephen should have left them alone, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Every time Susie looked at him across Ruby's sleeping form, he felt that electric connection that had plagued him for months. Around 4 in the morning, when Ruby was finally sleeping deeply, Susie carefully extracted herself from the rocking chair. She motioned for Stephen to follow her into the hallway. "Her fever's broken," Susie said quietly. "She should be fine by morning, but keep her home from school tomorrow." "Thank you," Stephen said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done. You would have figured it out," Susie assured him gently. "You're a good father, Stephen. Ruby knows you love her." They stood in the dimly lit hallway, the silence stretching between them heavy with unspoken words. Stephen found himself studying Susie's face in the soft light, the curve of her cheek, the fullness of her lips, the way her eyes seemed to hold depths he'd never fully explored. "I was wrong," he said suddenly. "About you. About everything. You never wanted anything from me except the chance to love my daughter." "She's easy to love," Susie replied softly. "So are you." The words slipped out before Stephen could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Susie's breath caught, her eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been hope. But as they moved closer, Stephen suddenly thought of Sarah's engagement ring, locked in his desk drawer, the promise he'd made never to touch another woman, never to dishonor his dead wife's memory. "I should let you get some rest," he said, stepping back abruptly, his voice breaking. "Thank you for coming." The hurt that flashed across Susie's face was like a knife to his heart, but she quickly composed herself. "Of course," she said quietly. "Call if Ruby needs anything else." She moved past him toward the stairs, pausing at the top to look back. "For what it's worth, I think Sarah would want you to be happy. She loved you too much to want you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself." Then she was gone, leaving Stephen alone in the hallway with the scent of jasmine and the echo of words that cut deeper than any blade. He stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she'd been, feeling the weight of his choices settling over him like a shroud. In Ruby's room, his daughter slept peacefully, her small hand clutched around a tissue that still smelled like Susie's perfume. And Stephen realized that he'd just made the same mistake twice, choosing fear over love, duty over happiness, the past over the future. But unlike 6 months ago, this time he understood exactly what he was losing. Chapter 7. The Confrontation and Confession. The 48-hour deadline Stephen had given his mother expired at precisely 6 p.m. on a rain-soaked Thursday evening. By 6:15, when no call had come, no wire transfer had been initiated, and no acknowledgement of wrongdoing had been received, Stephen knew that Celeste had chosen to dig in her heels rather than face the consequences of her actions. He should have been prepared for it. His mother had never backed down from a fight in her life, had never admitted fault when she could deflect blame or manipulate circumstances to her advantage. But somehow, naively, he'd hoped that the magnitude of her crimes might have penetrated even her legendary selfishness. The call came at 6:47 p.m., just as Stephen was preparing to leave his office for the evening. Celeste's voice was crisp and businesslike, with no trace of the panic he'd seen in her eyes during their last confrontation. "Stephen, darling, I need you to come to the mansion immediately. We have urgent family matters to discuss. If this is about the foundation money—" "It's about Ruby's future," Celeste cut him off smoothly. "Her welfare, her security, her rightful place in this family. I think you'll find my proposal enlightening. And Stephen, come alone. This is a private family matter." The line went dead before Stephen could respond, leaving him staring at his phone with growing unease. He knew his mother well enough to recognize the tone she used when she believed she held the winning hand, when she was confident that circumstances would bend to her will. 20 minutes later, Stephen stood in the foyer of his childhood home, water dripping from his coat onto the same marble floors where he'd taken his first steps. The mansion felt different somehow, colder, more oppressive, as if the weight of family secrets had finally grown too heavy for even these grand walls to bear. Celeste was waiting for him in his father's old study, seated behind the massive mahogany desk that had intimidated Stephen as a child. But tonight he felt no trace of his boyhood awe. Tonight he saw her clearly for what she was, a woman who would sacrifice anyone and anything to maintain her own position and power. "Sit down, Stephen," she said, gesturing to the leather chair across from the desk. "We have a great deal to discuss." "There's nothing to discuss," Stephen replied, remaining standing. "You have until midnight to initiate the wire transfer, or I contact the FBI in the morning." Celeste's smile was sharp as a blade. "I don't think you'll be doing that." She opened a thick manila folder and spread its contents across the desk surface. "Legal documents, court filings, custody evaluations, and medical reports." Stephen's blood chilled as he recognized what he was looking at. "Do you know what this is?" Celeste asked conversationally, her fingers drumming against the desk. "It's a comprehensive case file documenting your unfitness as a parent." "That's ridiculous, is it?" Celeste picked up a document from the pile. Exhibit A, medical records showing that Ruby has been hospitalized 3 times in the past 6 months for stress-related illnesses. Exhibit B, school reports documenting her declining academic performance and increasingly disruptive behavior. Exhibit C, testimony from concerned staff members about your frequent absences from home and neglect of your daughter's emotional needs. Stephen's hands clenched into fists. Those are lies, manipulations. Exhibit D, Celeste continued relentlessly. Psychological evaluation suggesting that Ruby's attachment to Susie Lama represents an unhealthy fixation born from your failure to provide adequate emotional support after her mother's death. You hired psychologists to analyze my daughter? I hired professionals to document the truth, Celeste corrected. That you're an unstable, grief-stricken man who has repeatedly exposed his child to traumatic abandonment by allowing inappropriate women into her life. The words hit Stephen like physical blows. He could see how easily a court might be swayed by such carefully constructed evidence, how his mother's wealth and connections could turn Ruby's genuine need for love into proof of his own inadequacy. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want you to cut all ties with Susie Lama immediately and permanently," Celeste said. "No contact, no communication, no involvement in your life or Ruby's. In return, these documents disappear and Ruby remains safely in your custody." "And if I refuse?" Celeste's smile was triumphant. "Then I file for emergency custody based on your inability to provide a stable home environment. Given my sterling reputation in family court and the compelling evidence I've gathered, I'm confident Ruby will be placed in my care while a full investigation proceeds." The threat hung in the air between them like poison. Stephen could see his mother's strategy. Clearly, she would take Ruby not out of love, but as leverage, as a way to ensure his silence about her crimes. His daughter would become a prisoner in this cold mansion, raised by a woman whose heart was as empty as her conscience. "You would destroy an innocent child to save yourself," Stephen said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "I would save this family." "From your destructive impulses," Celeste replied. "Susie Lama is a threat to everything we've built, everything we represent. She's already turned you against me, convinced you to believe her lies about the foundation." "They weren't lies." Stephen's voice was deadly quiet. "I've seen the evidence, Mother. The bank records, the shell companies, the forged documents. Every word she told me was true." For a moment, Celeste's mask slipped, revealing the desperate woman beneath. But she recovered quickly, her expression hardening into something resembling steel. "Then you understand the stakes," she said. "Choose, Stephen, your daughter's welfare or your infatuation with a woman who will never be anything more than Sarah's shadow." Stephen stared at the documents spread across the desk, feeling the walls of his life closing in around him. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd tried to protect, was being used against him by the woman who'd given him life. "I need time to think," he said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," Celeste replied. "Make the right choice, Stephen, for Ruby's sake." The drive back to his office through the rain-slicked streets was a blur of conflicting emotions and impossible decisions. Stephen felt trapped in a web of his mother's making, caught between his love for his daughter and his growing feelings for the woman who'd shown him what real love looked like. He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost missed the light glowing in his office window as he pulled into the parking garage. Jennifer had left hours ago, and the cleaning staff didn't work on Thursdays. Someone was in his office, someone who shouldn't be there. Stephen took the elevator to the 15th floor with his heart pounding, prepared for anything from corporate espionage to outright theft. But when he opened his office door, he found Susie Lama sitting in his chair, a laptop open in front of her and stacks of documents spread across his desk. She looked up as he entered, her green eyes reflecting the glow from the computer screen. "Hello, Stephen. We need to talk." "How did you get in here?" he asked, closing the door behind him. Security recognized me from the charity events, Susie replied matter-of-factly. And your night janitor was very helpful once I explained that I was here on foundation business. Stephen moved closer to the desk, seeing more clearly what she'd been working on. Financial spreadsheets, bank statements, legal documents, all related to his mother's embezzlement scheme. I know what she threatened you with tonight, Susie said quietly. The custody case, the psychological evaluations, the manufactured evidence of your unfitness as a father. How could you possibly— Because I've been investigating her for months, Susie interrupted. Not just the embezzlement, Stephen, everything. Her business dealings, her legal maneuvers, her network of corrupt officials and compliant experts. I know about Dr. Harrison, the child psychologist she's paying to write damaging reports about. Ruby, I know about Judge Morrison, who owes her favors dating back 15 years. I know about every lie, every manipulation, every crime she's committed to maintain her power. Stephen sank into the chair across from his desk, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what Susie was revealing. Why? Why go to all this trouble? Because Ruby deserves better than to be used as a pawn in her grandmother's games, Susie said fiercely. Because the foundation's money belongs to children who need help, not to a woman who already has more wealth than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. And because— She paused, her voice softening. Because I couldn't bear the thought of you suffering for crimes you didn't commit. The words hit Stephen like a revelation. Here was the woman he'd cast out, the woman he'd believed was part of his mother's schemes, working tirelessly to protect him and his daughter from forces he'd been too blind to see. I don't understand, he said, his voice rough with emotion. After everything I did to you, everything I chose to believe about you, why would you help me? Susie closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, studying his face with those penetrating green eyes. Because I love Ruby as if she were my own daughter, and because I love you, even though you've made it clear that love is neither wanted nor returned. The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge he was afraid to cross. Stephen felt something crack inside his chest, the first fissure in the wall he'd built around his heart. You don't know what you're saying, he whispered. You don't know what kind of man I really am. I know exactly what kind of man you are, Susie replied gently. You're a man who loves so deeply that you'd rather destroy your own happiness than risk hurting someone else. You're a man who carries guilt that isn't yours to bear, who punishes himself for tragedies beyond his control. I killed her. The words tore from Stephen's throat like a physical wound. Sarah died because of me, because of my ambition, my need to succeed at any cost. She was rushing through a storm to bring me documents for a deal that didn't matter, for money I didn't need, and she died because I was too selfish to drive myself. Tears he'd held back for months finally spilled over, years of suppressed grief and guilt pouring out in a torrent of anguish. I made a vow to her, Susie, a sacred promise that I would never touch another woman, never love anyone else, never dishonor her memory by moving on. I locked my heart away because it was the only way I could live with what I'd done. Susie was around the desk in an instant, kneeling beside his chair and taking his hands in hers. Stephen, listen to me. Sarah's death was an accident, a tragic, horrible accident that no one could have prevented. But if I hadn't asked her to, she would have found another reason to drive that night, Susie said firmly. Because that's who Sarah was, a woman who would do anything for the people she loved. You think she brought you those documents because you demanded it? She brought them because she believed in you, because she wanted to be part of your success. Stephen stared at her, seeing something in her eyes that he'd missed before. Not just compassion, but knowledge. Intimate, personal knowledge that spoke to conversations he'd never been part of. How do you know that? He asked. Susie's expression grew soft and sad. Because Sarah called me that night just before she left the house. She was so excited, Stephen, so proud of you and the deal you were closing. She said it was going to change. Everything for your family, secure Ruby's future, prove to the world what she'd always known, that you were destined for greatness. The words hit Stephen like a physical blow. She called you? She was planning to surprise you at the office, Susie continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. She wanted to be there when you signed the contracts, to celebrate with you. The documents were just an excuse. She really came, because she loved you and wanted to share your moment of triumph. Stephen's world tilted on its axis as the truth settled over him. Sarah hadn't died because of his ambition. She'd died because of her love, her desire to be part of his life even in the smallest ways. But her last words, he said desperately. She must have regretted her last words, Susie interrupted, were, "Take care of my girls." She made me promise to look after Ruby and you because she knew you would blame yourself, knew you would need someone to remind you that love isn't a burden to be carried, but a gift to be shared. The confession shattered the last of Stephen's defenses. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions he'd suppressed for too long. "She wanted you to find love again," Susie whispered, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "She was terrified that you would lock yourself away, that you would let guilt consume the beautiful heart she fell in love with. She made me promise to help you heal, to show you that loving someone new doesn't diminish what you shared with her." When Stephen finally looked up, his eyes were red with tears, but clearer than they'd been in months. "How long have you known?" "Since the night I met Ruby," Susie admitted. "When she called me Mama, when she looked at me with such hope and trust, I knew this was what Sarah had meant. This was why she'd made me promise." Stephen reached for her, his hands framing her face with desperate tenderness. "I've been such a fool." "You've been grieving," Susie corrected gently. "There's a difference. I pushed you away when you were trying to honor her wishes. I believed my mother's lies when you were trying to save us all." "None of that matters now," Susie said, leaning into his touch. "What matters is what we choose to do going forward." Stephen felt the last of his resistance crumble as he stared into her eyes, eyes that held no judgment, no demand for penance, only love and forgiveness, and the promise of a future he'd thought was lost forever. "I love you," he said, the words tasting like freedom on his lips. "God help me, I love you so much it terrifies me." Susie's smile was radiant, transforming her face with pure joy. "I love you too. I've loved you since the night I first held your daughter, since I saw the man Sarah described in her letters, strong and gentle and worthy of everything good the world has to offer." This time, when Stephen leaned forward to kiss her, nothing held him back. No vows, no guilt, no fear, only love, pure and transformative and long overdue. Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of tears and promises, of redemption and new beginnings. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Stephen felt truly alive, finally free to embrace the love that had been waiting for him all along. Chapter 8. The Liberation and First Surrender. Dawn was breaking over the city skyline when Stephen finally pulled away from Susie's kiss, his heart racing and his body alive with sensations he'd forgotten he could feel. Sarah's true blessing, delivered through the woman who now held his heart, had shattered the chains he'd wrapped around his soul for months. "We need to stop Celeste before she does something desperate," Susie said, her voice breathless but determined. "She's cornered now, and cornered animals are dangerous." Stephen nodded, his hands still framing her face, as if afraid she might disappear. "What do you suggest?" "I've documented everything. The embezzlement, the forged custody documents, the bribes to court officials. But we need to move fast. If she realizes I have this evidence, she might try to take Ruby and flee the country." As if summoned by her words, Stephen's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Mrs. Henderson. Ruby's school called. Celeste picked her up an hour ago with forged authorization documents claiming family emergency. School realized documents were suspicious after she left. Police have been notified. Stephen's blood turned to ice. She has Ruby. Susie was already moving, grabbing her laptop and the scattered documents. I have contacts from my bookkeeping days, people who work with private investigation services. If she's planning to run, she won't run, Stephen said grimly, pocketing his phone. She'll use Ruby as leverage, try to force a standoff where she controls the terms. My mother never retreats. She escalates. They raced through the empty office building and down to the parking garage, Stephen's mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. Ruby would be terrified, confused about why her grandmother was suddenly taking her away from everything familiar. And if Celeste was desperate enough to kidnap a child, there was no telling what other lines she might cross. The lake house, Stephen said suddenly as they reached his car. She'll take Ruby to the family cabin upstate. It's isolated, defensible, and she keeps it stocked like a bunker. The drive north took 45 minutes through pre-dawn traffic, Stephen pushing his Mercedes to its limits while Susie worked her phone, coordinating with law enforcement contacts and private investigators. By the time they reached the winding mountain road that led to the lake house, they had backup en route and legal warrants being processed. But all of that seemed academic when they spotted Stephen's mother's black SUV parked in the circular driveway of the rustic cabin, smoke rising from the chimney indicating someone was inside. "Let me go in first," Stephen said as they parked behind a stand of pine trees 100 yards from the house. "If she sees you, she might panic and do something to hurt Ruby." "We go together," Susie replied firmly. "Ruby needs to see that we're united, that she's safe with both of us." They approached the cabin cautiously, Stephen using his key to unlock the front door as quietly as possible. The sound of voices drifted from the main room, Celeste's sharp tones interspersed with Ruby's smaller, frightened responses. "Grandmama, I want to go home," Ruby was saying, her voice thick with tears. "I want Daddy and Mama Susie." "Your father isn't thinking clearly right now," Celeste replied, her tone falsely soothing. "He's been influenced by that woman, convinced to make poor choices, but we'll keep you safe until he comes to his senses." Stephen and Susie exchanged a look, then moved silently through the entryway toward the sound of voices. From the doorway to the main room, they could see Ruby sitting on the leather couch, her small frame dwarfed by oversized pillows, while Celeste paced in front of the fireplace like a caged animal. "Ruby," Stephen called softly, stepping into the room with his hands visible and non-threatening, the little girl's face lit up with relief and joy. "Daddy, you found me." But before she could run to him, Celeste moved with startling speed, positioning herself between Stephen and his daughter, with something glinting in her hand, a small silver pistol that had belonged to Stephen's father. "Don't come any closer," Celeste warned, her voice shaking but her grip on the weapon steady. "I won't let you destroy this family's legacy for some gold-digging imposter." "Grandmama, you're scaring me," Ruby whimpered, pressing herself deeper into the couch cushions. Her small voice was high and frightened, every bit the confused 5-year-old caught in an adult situation beyond her understanding. "Put the gun down, Mother," Stephen said calmly, his heart pounding as he calculated distances and angles. "Ruby doesn't need to see this. Ruby needs to understand that sometimes we have to fight for what's right," Celeste replied. But her eyes were wild, unfocused. "That woman has poisoned your mind, turned you against your own family, Celeste." Susie's voice cut through the tension as she stepped into view, her hands raised peacefully. "It's over. The FBI has all the evidence they need about the embezzlement. The custody documents have been exposed as forgeries. There's nowhere left to run." The older woman's face crumpled, years of careful composure finally cracking under the weight of exposure and defeat. "You don't understand what you've done," she whispered. "This family has power, influence, responsibility. We can't just... We can be honest, Stephen interrupted. We can face the consequences of our actions and try to build something better, for Ruby's sake. The standoff stretched for an eternity, tension thick in the air as three adults faced the wreckage of pride and ambition while a frightened child watched from the couch. Then Ruby did something that changed everything. "Grandmama," she said in her clear, sweet voice, "Mama Susie makes the best pancakes in the whole world, and she knows all the words to my favorite songs. And when I have bad dreams, she holds me until they go away." The simple words hit Celeste like a physical blow. She looked at her granddaughter, really looked at her, and seemed to see for the first time the happiness that Susie brought to Ruby's life. "She's not trying to hurt us," Ruby continued with the devastating honesty of childhood. "She loves me, and she loves Daddy, just like Mama Sarah did." The gun in Celeste's hand wavered, then slowly lowered as the last of her resistance crumbled. "I thought I was protecting you," she said, her voice broken. "I thought I was doing what was best." "I know," Stephen said gently, moving slowly toward. But the only protection Ruby needs is love, and she has that, from all of us." 20 minutes later, Celeste was in the back of a police cruiser, her wrists cuffed, but her demeanor strangely peaceful, as if the burden of maintaining her facade had finally become too heavy to bear. The federal agents were polite, but efficient, their investigation into the foundation fraud now moving into high gear. But all of that seemed distant and unimportant as Stephen held his daughter in the cabin's main room, Ruby's small arms wrapped around his neck as she clung to him with desperate relief. "I was so scared, Daddy," she whispered against his shoulder. "Grandmama said you didn't love me anymore, that you were going to send me away." "Never," Stephen said fiercely, his voice thick with emotion. "I will never send you away, sweetheart. You are the most important thing in my world, and I will always, always fight for you." "What about Mama Susie?" Ruby asked, pulling back to look at him with worried eyes. "Is she going to leave again?" Stephen looked across the room to where Susie stood by the window, silhouetted against the morning light streaming through the glass. She was beautiful and strong and infinitely precious, and the thought of losing her again made his chest tight with panic. "That depends," he said, meeting Susie's eyes. "Mama Susie, would you like to come home with us? For real this time?" Susie's smile was radiant as she crossed the room and knelt beside them, her arms encircling both Stephen and Ruby in the embrace that felt like coming home. "I would love nothing more," she whispered. The drive back to the city was peaceful, Ruby chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to show Susie. Her art projects, her favorite books, the secret hiding place in the garden where she kept her treasures. But beneath the domestic normalcy, Stephen was acutely aware of the tension building between him and Susie, the electric current that seemed to arc between them every time their eyes met. They had loved each other across months of separation and misunderstanding. They had fought together to protect Ruby and expose the truth. They had finally acknowledged the feelings that had been building since that first night when Susie read bedtime stories in Sarah's memory. Now, with the obstacles finally cleared away, the desire that had been carefully controlled for so long demanded its due. That evening, after Ruby had been fed and bathed and tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed animal and a story about brave princesses, Stephen found Susie in the master bedroom, standing by the window that overlooked the garden Sarah had loved. "Second thoughts?" he asked softly, his heart clenching at the possibility. Susie turned, and the look in her eyes made his breath catch. "No second thoughts. But Stephen, I need you to be sure, really sure, because once we cross this line, there's no going back." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he replied, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. I love you, Susie. I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much. When he reached her, he cupped her face in his hands, studying every feature as if memorizing them. I want to worship every inch of your beautiful body, he said, his voice rough with desire. I want to love you the way you deserve to be loved, completely, passionately, without reservation. Susie's breath hitched as his thumbs traced the delicate line of her cheekbones. I've dreamed of this, she whispered, of being yours, of belonging to you completely. Stephen's control snapped at her words. He kissed her with months of suppressed hunger, his mouth claiming hers with desperate intensity while his hands tangled in her dark hair. Susie responded with equal fervor, her body melting against his as she gave herself over to the desire that had been building between them for so long. I need to touch you, Stephen murmured against her lips, his hands already working at the buttons of her blouse. I need to feel your skin against mine. Susie's answer was to help him remove the barriers between them, her fingers trembling with anticipation as she pushed his shirt from his shoulders. When they were finally skin to skin, Stephen nearly groaned at the sensation, the softness of her breasts against his chest, the warmth of her body pressed along the length of his. You're so beautiful, he breathed, his hands skimming reverently over her curves. So perfect, he lifted her easily, carrying her to the bed where he laid her down with exquisite gentleness. For a long moment he simply looked at her, hair spread across the pillows like dark silk, green eyes luminous with love and desire, lips swollen from his kisses. I want to take my time with you, he said, his voice husky with promise. I want to learn every place that makes you sigh, every touch that makes you surrender. He began with her hands, pressing gentle kisses to each fingertip before working his way up her arms with slow, deliberate caresses. When he reached the sensitive hollow of her throat, Susie arched beneath him, a soft moan escaping her lips. Stephen, please, she whispered, her hands fisting in his hair as he lavished attention on the place where her pulse fluttered wildly. But he wouldn't be rushed. He worshipped her body with the devotion of a man who had thought he'd never feel such desire again, his mouth and hands mapping every curve and valley with reverent precision. When he finally claimed her completely, their joining was both tender and explosive, months of longing and love pouring between them in waves of overwhelming sensation. They moved together in perfect harmony, their bodies finding a rhythm as natural as breathing. Stephen whispered words of love and apology and promise against her skin, while Susie showed him forgiveness and acceptance through every caress, every kiss, every soft cry of pleasure. When release finally claimed them, it was with an intensity that left them both shaking, clinging to each other as if afraid the moment might disappear like a dream. I love you, Stephen said against her hair as they lay entwined in the aftermath, their hearts gradually slowing to a more normal rhythm. I love you more than I ever thought possible. I love you too, Susie replied, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest, always. They made love twice more that night, each encounter deeper and more passionate than the last. Stephen couldn't get enough of her, the taste of her skin, the sound of her sighs, the way she came apart in his arms with such beautiful abandon. And Susie met his passion with her own fierce desire, claiming him as completely as he claimed her. As dawn broke over the garden outside their window, they lay exhausted and sated in each other's arms, their bodies still intertwined, their hearts finally at peace. No more secrets, Stephen said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. No more misunderstandings, just us and Ruby and the love we found. Just love, Susie agreed, her voice soft with contentment. Finally. Outside their window, the morning glories in Sarah's garden were beginning to bloom, opening their faces to the sun in a silent blessing of the love that had finally found its way home. Chapter 9. the reckoning and complete surrender. 3 months. After Celeste's arrest, Stephen stood in the state courthouse, watching his mother being led away in handcuffs, her designer suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit that seemed to diminish her somehow. The charges were extensive: embezzlement, fraud, attempted kidnapping, and child endangerment. With the mountain of evidence Susie had compiled and Celeste's guilty plea to avoid federal charges, the state prosecution had moved swiftly. 12 to 18 years, the prosecutor had said. Given Mrs. Sinclair's age and the plea agreement, she'll likely serve the full sentence. Stephen felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a profound sadness for the woman who had chosen greed and control over love and family. But as he walked out of the courthouse with Susie beside him and Ruby's small hand in his, he knew that some endings were necessary for new beginnings to flourish. "Is Grandmama going to be okay?" Ruby asked as they settled into the car, her 6-year-old mind struggling to understand the complexities of adult choices and consequences. "She's going to a place where she can think about the things she did wrong," Stephen explained gently, "and hopefully learn to be better." "Will she still be my grandmama?" Susie reached back from the front seat to take Ruby's hand. "Family isn't just about blood, sweetheart. It's about the people who love you and take care of you and want you to be happy. Your daddy and I will always be your family, no matter what." Ruby seemed to consider this for a moment, then brightened with the resilience of childhood. "Can we have ice cream for dinner tonight, to celebrate being a real family?" Stephen caught Susie's eye in the rearview mirror, and the love he saw there made his chest tight with emotion. "I think that sounds perfect." The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and foundation restructuring. Stephen had personally overseen the return of every stolen dollar to the Sarah Vidal Memorial Foundation, then expanded its mission to include programs for children affected by white-collar crime. The irony wasn't lost on him. His mother's crimes had ultimately led to helping even more children in need. But more important than the legal victories was the transformation in their small family. Ruby had blossomed under Susie's loving care, her nightmares fading and her laughter returning in abundance. The house that had felt like a mausoleum for months was now filled with the sounds of life: Ruby's giggles, Susie's gentle singing, the comfortable domesticity of a family learning to love again. And Stephen himself felt reborn. The guilt that had consumed him for months had been replaced by a sense of purpose and joy he'd thought lost forever. Waking up each morning with Susie in his arms, watching her help Ruby with breakfast and homework and bedtime stories, seeing the way they loved each other so completely, it was everything he'd never dared to hope for. Tonight, though, was special. Tonight, he was going to make their unconventional family official. "Daddy, look what Mama Susie and I made," Ruby called from the kitchen as they entered the house. She held up a slightly lopsided cake decorated with pink frosting and rainbow sprinkles. "It's a celebration cake." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Stephen said, lifting Ruby into his arms for a kiss. "What are we celebrating?" "Being together," Ruby replied simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Over dinner, ice cream sundaes served in fancy crystal bowls because Ruby insisted that celebrations required proper dishes. Stephen watched his 2 favorite people and felt his heart swell with love so profound it was almost painful. Susie caught him staring and raised an eyebrow in silent question, but he just smiled and shook his head. She'd understand soon enough. After Ruby had been bathed and tucked into bed with extra stories and kisses, Stephen found Susie in the garden, tending to the morning glories that had become her particular passion. She looked ethereal in the moonlight, her white sundress flowing around her as she moved among the flowers. "They're beautiful," Stephen said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Sarah planted them the year Ruby was born. Susie replied, leaning back against his chest. She told me they represented new beginnings, fresh hope blooming every day. Fitting, Stephen murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Susie, I need to ask you something. She turned in his arms, her green eyes searching his face. What is it? Before Stephen could answer, a small voice piped up from the French doors leading to the garden. Now, Daddy! Ruby appeared on the terrace, still in her pajamas but wide awake with excitement. Stephen had told her about his plan earlier, swearing her to secrecy, and she'd been vibrating with anticipation all evening. Now, Stephen confirmed, taking Susie's hand and leading her to the garden's center, where a small gazebo was lit with strings of fairy lights that Ruby had helped him hang that afternoon. Stephen, what's going on? Susie asked, but her voice was breathless with hope. Ruby ran to them, carrying a small velvet box that seemed enormous in her tiny hands. Daddy has something to ask you, Mama Susie. Stephen took the box from his daughter, then dropped to one knee in front of the woman who had saved his family in every way that mattered. Susie's hands flew to her mouth, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Susie Lama, Stephen began, his voice thick with emotion. 6 months ago, you walked into our lives and changed everything. You loved my daughter when she needed it most. You fought for our family when I was too blind to see the truth. You showed me that love isn't something to be rationed or feared, but something to be celebrated and shared. He opened the box, revealing not Sarah's ring, that would always belong to his first love, but a stunning emerald surrounded by diamonds that caught the fairy lights like captured starfire. You are my second chance, my redemption, my future. You are Ruby's chosen mother and my chosen partner. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife officially and forever? Say yes, Mama Susie, Ruby urged, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Say yes so we can be a real family forever and ever. Susie looked down at Stephen's hopeful face, then at Ruby's eager expression, then back at the ring that sparkled like a promise of everything she'd ever dreamed of. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, of course, yes. Stephen slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as Ruby cheered and clapped. When he finally set her down, his kiss was deep and passionate, full of love and promise and the joy of a future they would build together. When? Susie asked, when they finally broke apart. When do you want to have the wedding? Tomorrow, Ruby announced. I want to be the flower girl tomorrow. Stephen and Susie laughed, but there was something appealing about Ruby's eagerness. They'd already lost so much time to misunderstandings and external forces. Why wait any longer than necessary? What do you think? Stephen asked Susie. We could do something small, intimate, just family and close friends. I think, Susie said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him again. That sounds perfect. An hour later, after Ruby had finally been convinced to go back to bed with promises that wedding planning could begin first thing in the morning, Stephen and Susie found themselves alone in their bedroom. The engagement ring caught the lamplight as Susie reached for him, her eyes dark with desire and love. I can't believe this is real, she whispered as Stephen's hands framed her face. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream. Not a dream, Stephen assured her, his voice rough with need. This is real. You're real. We're real. He kissed her with months of suppressed emotion, all the fear and longing and desperate love pouring between them. Susie responded, with equal fervor, her body molding against his as they sank onto the bed together. I want to love you, Stephen said against her lips. I want to show you how grateful I am, how much you mean to me. Then love me, Susie replied, her hands already working at the buttons of his shirt. Love me completely. They came together, with the passion of lovers who had fought for their right to be together, who had overcome obstacles and enemies and their own fears to find each other. Stephen worshipped her body with reverent hands and hungry mouth, determined to show her through touch what words couldn't adequately express. Susie met his passion with her own fierce desire, claiming him as completely as he claimed her. They moved together with desperate intensity, months of longing and separation, fueling their need for connection, for unity, for the physical proof that they belonged to each other. "I love you," Stephen groaned as he joined with her, the sensation overwhelming in its perfection. "God, Susie, I love you so much." "Show me," she gasped, her nails digging into his shoulders as she pulled him deeper. "Show me how much." He did, with every thrust and caress and whispered endearment. They made love with abandon, their bodies speaking a language older than words, their souls finally finding the harmony they'd been seeking. When climax claimed them, it was with shattering intensity, their cries of completion echoing through the room as they collapsed together, spent and sated and completely connected. "Mine!" Stephen whispered against her hair as they lay entwined in the aftermath. "Finally mine." "Yours," Susie agreed, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "Always yours." They made love twice more that night, each encounter more passionate than the last, as if they were trying to make up for all the time they'd lost, all the nights they'd spent apart and longing. By dawn, they were exhausted but exhilarated, their bodies marked by their passion, their hearts full to overflowing. "No more waiting," Stephen said as the first rays of sunlight crept through their windows. "No more obstacles or misunderstandings, or people trying to keep us apart. Just us," Susie agreed, pressing a soft kiss to his jaw. "Just love." And as they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, the morning glories in Sarah's garden began to open their faces to the sun, welcoming a new day full of infinite possibilities. Chapter 10. The Wedding and Eternal Love. 6 weeks later, on a perfect spring morning when the garden was in full bloom, Susie stood before the antique mirror in what had once been Sarah's bedroom, adjusting the delicate pearl necklace that had been her sister's wedding gift to her. The wedding dress, ivory silk and vintage lace that Jennifer had commissioned, was elegant but not ostentatious, exactly right for a ceremony that would be intimate and heartfelt rather than grand. "You look like a princess, Mama Susie," Ruby exclaimed from the doorway, her own dress a confection of pale pink tulle. "Daddy's going to cry when he sees you." "Happy tears, I hope," Susie replied, embracing the little girl who had become the daughter of her heart. "Are you ready to be my flower girl?" Through the window, Susie could see the garden where white chairs faced an archway covered in climbing roses. It was a small gathering. Ruby, the household staff, Jennifer, Dr. Patterson, and a few close friends. But most importantly, in the front row, there was an empty chair with a single white rose. Sarah's place, acknowledged and honored. Susie had suggested it, and Stephen had been so moved he'd held her for 20 minutes without speaking. "Miss Susie?" Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. "It's time." The string quartet began Pachelbel's canon, and Ruby walked solemnly down the petal-strewn aisle, scattering rose petals with concentrated precision. Then the music shifted to the wedding march, and Susie stepped into the garden. Stephen waited, beneath the rose-covered archway, devastating in his charcoal suit, but it was his expression that made her heart race. Pure love and adoration, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. When she reached him, Stephen took her hands, his voice husky with emotion as he spoke his practiced vows. "Susie," he began, "when I met you, I thought my capacity for love had died with Sarah. But you showed me that love isn't diminished by loss, it's expanded by it. You saved my daughter when she needed it most. You saved me when I was drowning in guilt and fear. Now you're giving me the chance to love again, to build a future filled with hope and joy." Susie's tears flowed freely. "Stephen, I fell in love with your father's heart before I ever fell in love with the man. You taught me that love isn't about perfection, it's about showing up, even when it's hard. I promised to love Ruby as fiercely, As I love you, to honor Sarah's memory by building the family she dreamed of, and to spend every day proving that second chances can be even more beautiful than first loves. When Stephen finally kissed his bride, the kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise. Ruby cheered, the guests laughed and cried, and somewhere in the garden, the morning glories seemed to bloom brighter. The reception was held on the terrace. With Mrs. Henderson's elegant feast, Ruby gave a speech about being happy to finally have a real mama forever and promising to be the best big sister when the babies came. Babies? Stephen raised an eyebrow at Susie, who blushed. She's been planning our family expansion since the engagement, Susie explained. As the sun set and guests departed, Stephen and Susie finally found themselves alone in their bedroom, now officially husband and wife. Rose petals from the garden were scattered across the bed, and fairy lights cast a magical glow. "Hello, Mrs. Vidal," Stephen said softly, taking her in his arms. "Hello, husband," Susie replied. Their wedding night was everything their previous. Encounters had been and more, tender and passionate, loving and wild, a celebration of their union that lasted until dawn. Stephen worshipped every inch of his wife's body with reverent hands and hungry mouth. "I love you," he whispered as they moved together in perfect harmony. "My wife, my heart, my everything." "Forever," Susie gasped. "I'm yours forever." They made love with the desperate passion of lovers who had fought for their right to be together, but also with the tender intimacy of a husband and wife who knew they had a lifetime to explore and discover each other. When release finally claimed them, it was with shattering intensity, their bodies and souls united in perfect completion. Later, as they lay entwined, Stephen traced gentle patterns on Susie's bare shoulder, marveling at the peace that had settled. "Over his life. What are you thinking about?" Susie asked drowsily. "Everything," Stephen replied. "Ruby's happiness, the foundation's work, our life together. How completely different everything is from what I imagined a year ago." "Different how?" "Better. So much better than I ever thought possible. Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for Sarah. It honors it. She taught me how to love completely, and that gift made it possible for me to love you with everything I have." Susie lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes luminous. "I think she'd be happy for us." "I know she would," Stephen agreed. "And I think she'd be especially happy about this." He placed his hand over Susie's still, flat stomach, his eyes twinkling with secret knowledge. "Stephen, do you think—" "I think," he said, leaning down to kiss her softly, "that Ruby is going to get her wish about being a big sister sooner than expected." 9 months later, Susie gave birth to twin boys, Alexander and Samuel Vidal, healthy and perfect. Ruby was beside herself with joy, appointing herself their official protector. The Sarah Vidal Memorial Foundation flourished under honest leadership, helping thousands of children and families. Stephen's business empire continued to grow and prosper, now run with ethics and transparency. But more than professional success, Stephen had found something infinitely more valuable. A love that had healed his heart, a family that brought him joy every single day, and the knowledge that some endings are really beginnings in disguise. On quiet evenings, when the twins were sleeping and Ruby was tucked in with her bedtime stories, Stephen and Susie would walk through Sarah's garden hand in hand, watching the morning glories close their faces for the night and dreaming about the future they would build together. "Any regrets?" Stephen asked one particularly perfect evening. Susie looked at their beautiful home, thought about Ruby's laughter and the twins' first smiles, felt the solid warmth of her husband's hand in hers. "Only one," she said, smiling up at him with eyes full of mischief and love. "What's that? That it took us so long to find each other?" Stephen's answer was a kiss that tasted of promises kept and dreams fulfilled, of love that had conquered every obstacle and would endure for all the days of their lives. In the garden around them, the morning glories slept peacefully, preparing to bloom again with the dawn, eternal symbols of hope, renewal, and love that grows stronger with each passing day.